Amara Blackwell had spent over a decade in the fire department, earning her reputation not just as a skilled inspector but as someone who never backed down from a fight, whether that fight was against raging flames or the slow-burning corruption that threatened the very infrastructure she was sworn to protect. She had seen firsthand how the city operated, how resources were conveniently rerouted away from certain neighborhoods while others flourished, how maintenance requests in wealthier districts were processed within days while those in underprivileged areas were left to rot under bureaucratic neglect. It was a cycle she had long stopped being surprised by, but never one she was willing to accept. She had made it her personal mission to ensure that every fire hydrant, every water line, every emergency system was fully operational, no matter where it was located or who it was meant to serve. That was what had brought her here today, to the scorching asphalt of one of the city's most overlooked districts, where the heat bore down relentlessly and the air shimmered with the illusion of relief that never came. The sun hung high, merciless and unyielding, baking the cracked pavement and turning parked cars into searing metal coffins. The people in this neighborhood were used to enduring the elements with little help from the city, but there were some things even they couldn't fight against. A fire breaking out in these conditions would be catastrophic, and the hydrants, the first and often only line of defense against disaster, had to be in working order. Amara wiped the sweat from her brow as she crouched beside the hydrant, wrench in hand, adjusting the bolts that had long since rusted into place. The city hadn't bothered to maintain this one for years. She had received reports from locals about its failure, how it barely sputtered out a trickle when tested, how the fire department had ignored their calls because there were more pressing concerns. That was the phrase always used to justify neglect, more pressing concerns. As if their lives mattered less than the towering skyscrapers downtown with their state-of-the-art suppression systems, as if the heat here didn't burn as fiercely, as if flames chose their victims based on income brackets. She twisted the valve, feeling the resistance before it gave way, a deep metallic groan echoing from within the pipes. A second later, a jet of water shot forth, the pressure building as it should, strong and steady. She watched the stream arc through the air before crashing down onto the pavement, instantly darkening the dry concrete beneath it. The system was working, at least for now. She reached for her clipboard, ready to mark it down, when the sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled her attention away. A police cruiser rolled to a slow stop a few feet away, the sun reflecting off its windshield, obscuring the driver from view. Amara exhaled through her nose, already predicting how this would go. The officers rarely showed up in this neighborhood for anything good. They weren't here to assist, to check in, to offer support. No, their presence was always reactionary, always a response to something they deemed suspicious, always an assertion of authority where it wasn't needed. The door creaked open, and out stepped Officer Doug Connolly, his uniform crisp, his sunglasses concealing his eyes, his posture radiating that particular kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked power. He didn't immediately acknowledge her, instead surveying the scene as if expecting to find trouble. His gaze landed on the flowing hydrant, then on her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Amara didn't react right away. She had encountered his type before, men who carried their badge like a weapon rather than a responsibility, men who had spent too long unchecked and unchallenged. She wasn't easily intimidated. Fixing the hydrant, she replied evenly, tapping her clipboard against her thigh. "It was out of commission. I'm making sure it's operational." Connolly's lip curled slightly, like he didn't quite believe her or didn't care. He took a slow step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. Nobody reported a broken hydrant. They did, she countered. Multiple times. The city just didn't care to follow up. His jaw tensed. "Who authorized this?" Amara arched a brow. The fire department. You know, the people responsible for making sure the city doesn't burn down. There was a beat of silence, the tension thickening between them. She could see the wheels turning in his head, the calculations being made. He didn't like her tone, didn't like that she wasn't showing the deference he expected, didn't like that she was here at all. You can't just open hydrants whenever you feel like it, he finally said, shifting his weight slightly, his hand resting near his utility belt. Not a direct threat, but not far from one either. Amara exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I don't need your permission to do my job, officer. She turned back toward the hydrant, but the moment she moved, he took another step forward, this time closer, his voice hardening. Shut it down. Amara stilled. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head to look at him. Excuse me, you heard me. Shut it down. Now, her grip on the wrench tightened. She had dealt with this kind of pushback before, but this was different. This wasn't just about jurisdiction or miscommunication. This was about control. He didn't want her here. He didn't want to be told he was wrong. And more than anything, he wanted her to submit. But Amara Blackwell didn't submit. A tense silence stretched between them, the hydrant's steady stream the only sound breaking the moment. Connolly squared his shoulders, waiting for her compliance, expecting it. Instead, she turned back to the hydrant and adjusted the valve, increasing the pressure. The water surged with greater force, a deliberate statement. Connolly's nostrils flared. His hand twitched toward the radio clipped to his shoulder, but he hesitated, as if weighing the optics of calling this in. He didn't need backup. Not for this. Not for her. That would be admitting he wasn't in control. So instead, he chose the other option. With a single, sudden movement, he lunged forward and grabbed the valve himself, yanking it hard in the opposite direction. But Amara was faster. She stepped into his space, using his own momentum against him, shoving him back just as the hydrant bucked under the sudden shift in pressure. The force of the water, now untamed, shot sideways right into Connolly's chest. The blast of water struck Officer Connolly square in the chest, the sheer force of it staggering him back a step before he found his footing. For a split second, the world seemed to hang in stunned silence, the only sound the unrelenting roar of the hydrant, the torrent of water carving a chaotic path across the pavement. His uniform darkened instantly, the fabric clinging to his body, drenched in an instant. Amara stood firm, gripping the wrench in her hand, her eyes locked onto him with an expression that was equal parts defiance and warning. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a miscalculation. This was control. This was her demonstrating, in no uncertain terms, that he was not the one in charge of this situation. Connolly reacted the way men like him always did when they felt their power slipping violently. With a furious growl, he lunged forward, his boots splashing through the newly formed puddles as he reached for her, his hand a blur as it grabbed for her arm. Amara twisted, dodging his grip, her training kicking in automatically. He might have had the authority of the badge, but she had years of experience working in high-stakes, high-pressure environments where hesitation meant injury or worse. She wasn't just some civilian unprepared for confrontation, she was a firefighter, a first responder, someone who had gone head-to-head with disasters far more dangerous than a power-hungry cop. But Connolly wasn't backing down. He came at her again, this time using his full weight, his arm hooking around hers in an attempt to restrain her. The second his fingers tightened, Amara reacted on instinct. Shifting her stance, she used his own momentum against him, pivoting sharply and slamming her elbow into his ribcage. It wasn't enough to do serious damage, but it sent a clear message back off. Connolly stumbled but quickly recovered, his face twisting with fury as he grabbed for his baton, the black steel glinting under the harsh sunlight as he swung it toward her midsection. Amara moved without thinking, dropping low and dodging the strike, feeling the wind of it pass just above her as she turned into him, her body moving like a reflex honed through years of physical training. She could have disengaged, could have backed away and tried to de-escalate, but she knew men like Connolly. De-escalation wasn't in his nature. He wanted submission, not compromise. He wanted to establish dominance, and when his authority was challenged, his only response was escalation. The moment she rose from her crouch, she grabbed the baton before he could bring it down again, twisting it sharply in his grip. His knuckles whitened as he resisted, but she was stronger than he had anticipated. With a final wrench, she tore the weapon from his grasp, stepping back with it in her hands. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Connolly's breath came in ragged bursts, his chest heaving as he glared at her, water dripping from his uniform. The fight hadn't gone the way he had expected. He wasn't used to being bested, especially not by someone like her, a firefighter. A woman. A black woman standing her ground in a neighborhood where he had always been the final authority. The fury in his eyes was almost tangible, a simmering rage that burned hotter than the sun overhead. He reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against the device clipped to his shoulder, but before he could call it in, something shifted. The dynamic of the moment changed. He wasn't just facing down Amara anymore, there were eyes on him now, real ones. The tension of the street had drawn attention, and now, for the first time, Connolly seemed to realize that he wasn't in control of this narrative. A few feet away, an older man stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Across the street, a woman had paused mid-step, her phone hanging loosely in her grip, though she hadn't yet raised it to record. Further down, a group of teenagers leaned against a wall, their eyes sharp, watching, waiting. And Connolly knew. He knew that the moment that radio crackled to life, the moment he tried to spin this into something it wasn't, these people would have their own version of the story. And for once, it wouldn't be just his word that shaped reality. Amara could see the calculations running through his mind, the shifting tides of rage and strategy battling for control. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles twitch. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't push him further, she just stood her ground, waiting. Seconds passed, stretched, held. Then, slowly, with an almost deliberate motion, Connolly lowered his hand from his radio. He exhaled sharply, a sound that was more frustration than surrender, and took a step back. His boots left wet prints on the pavement as he turned slightly, as if reconsidering his next move. The hydrant continued to spray water, the powerful stream still arching through the air, still evidence of the moment where he had lost control. Amara finally moved, tossing the baton onto the pavement between them, the metal clattering against the ground with a sharp sound that broke the silence like a gunshot. "Pick it up," she said, her tone devoid of mockery, devoid of triumph. Just a statement. And then walk away. For a moment he didn't move. His fists flexed at his sides, his breathing still uneven, his eyes locked onto her like he was trying to memorize every detail, every insult, every moment of defiance. But he wasn't stupid. Not completely. He bent down, slowly, fingers closing around the baton. When he straightened, he looked at her one last time before turning and walking back to his cruiser, his soaked uniform leaving a damp trail in his wake. The moment his hand touched the door handle, Amara finally exhaled, releasing the tension she hadn't realized she was holding in her own body. He didn't look back as he got in, didn't give her the satisfaction of acknowledging her victory, but she didn't need it. She turned away, wiping her hands on her jeans before bending back down to finish adjusting the hydrant. The job wasn't done yet, and unlike Connolly, she didn't leave things unfinished. Connolly sat in his cruiser, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Water dripped from his uniform onto the leather seat, pooling in the creases of his pants, soaking into the fabric like a slow, creeping infection. He could feel the cold seeping into his skin, but the heat in his chest burned hotter. His mind raced, replaying the scene over and over, the moment his control had been ripped from his hands, the moment Amara Blackwell had humiliated him in front of the very people he was supposed to keep in check. She had taken his baton, bested him physically, and then had the audacity to tell him to walk away. She thought she had won. She thought it was over. But it wasn't. Connolly wasn't a man who let things go. He wasn't someone who could swallow his pride and move on. He had spent too many years building his reputation, too many years making sure people knew who was in charge. And now, sitting in his car, watching the water still spraying from the hydrant, watching Amara finish what she had started, something inside him snapped. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder and pressed the button. Unit 17 requesting immediate backup. We have a situation escalating at the intersection of Mercer and 9th. Need additional officers on scene. His voice was calm, controlled, but laced with something darker. He wasn't going to let this end here. The dispatcher responded, confirming units were on the way. Connolly didn't move. He just sat there, his breathing steadying, his anger cooling into something sharper, more dangerous. He could still turn this around. He could still show her who had the real power here. Outside, Amara had finished adjusting the pressure on the hydrant and was standing up, wiping her hands on her jeans. She was about to turn away when she noticed the cruiser still sitting there, engine running, Connolly's silhouette barely visible through the windshield. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. He wasn't leaving. She had dealt with men like him before. Men who saw defiance as a challenge, who couldn't handle being proven wrong, who mistook strength for insubordination. She had seen them in city council meetings, in fire department disputes, in interactions on the street where authority was wielded like a weapon instead of a responsibility. And she knew, deep down, that he wasn't done. The first sirens reached her ears before she even saw the additional patrol cars. The sound sliced through the air, growing louder as two more cruisers turned onto the street, their lights flashing, the tires screeching slightly as they came to an abrupt stop near Connolly's vehicle. The doors opened in unison, and two officers stepped out, one older, stockier, with a hardened expression, the other younger, clearly still learning the ropes. They assessed the scene quickly, their eyes darting between Connolly's soaked uniform and Amara standing defiantly by the hydrant. The older officer, Sergeant Dwayne Fuller, was the first to speak. "What's going on here?" Doug, his tone was wary, like he already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Connolly didn't hesitate. Interference with city property. Resisting an officer. Physical assault. The words came out smoothly, rehearsed, as if he had already decided the story before they even arrived. Amara's eyes narrowed. "Are you serious?" Connolly turned to her, the smug satisfaction creeping back onto his face. "You assaulted an officer, Blackwell. That's a serious charge." Fuller frowned, glancing between them. "Doug, you want to explain why you look like you just got hit by a tsunami?" Connolly's jaw tightened. "She turned the hydrant on me. Deliberately." Amara crossed her arms. "You pulled the valve yourself. Then you attacked me." The younger officer, whose name tag read Jensen, shifted uncomfortably. "Did anyone else see this happen?" There was a pause. Then, voices from the sidewalk, from the windows above, from the people who had been watching since the beginning. "She didn't do anything wrong. He started it. We saw everything. Connolly's eyes flickered with something dangerous. He hadn't expected them to speak up. He had counted on fear, on the usual silence that accompanied situations like this. He had thought they would turn away, pretend they hadn't seen, like so many times before. But not this time. Fuller exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Doug, we're not arresting a city firefighter for doing her damn job." Connolly's face turned red. "She attacked me. She defended herself." The words came from Fuller, flat and final. Connolly looked like he was about to argue, but something about Fuller's tone stopped him. A different kind of silence settled over the street. And then, before anyone could react, Connolly moved. It was fast, so fast that for a second, it didn't register. One moment, he was standing there, furious, humiliated, and the next, he had grabbed the fire hose still connected to the hydrant, twisting the nozzle with practiced precision. The water surged forward in an instant, an uncontrollable force that exploded from the hose, slamming into Amara like a freight train. She barely had time to brace before the sheer power of the stream knocked her backward, sending her sprawling onto the pavement. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Someone shouted. Fuller swore. Amara hit the ground hard, the water unrelenting, pounding against her chest, her face, forcing her to shield herself with her arms. The force was staggering, like being caught in a rip current, dragged under with no way to fight back. The pressure stole her breath, her vision blurring as the torrent kept coming. And through it all, she could hear Connolly laughing. The bastard was laughing. He was enjoying this. That realization cut through the disorientation, through the water crashing against her, through the roar in her ears. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself to move, to shift her weight, to dig her fingers into the pavement and push herself up. The pressure made it nearly impossible, but she wasn't giving him the satisfaction of staying down. Slowly, agonizingly, she got to her knees, then to her feet, the water still slamming into her, but she was standing now, and she saw the exact moment Connolly's laughter died, because she wasn't just standing. She was moving. With a burst of strength, she lunged forward, her hands closing around the hose just below the nozzle. Connolly's grin twisted into something else, something startled, something uncertain. He tried to yank it back, but she held firm, planting her feet, using the full weight of her body against his. And then, with one swift motion, she wrenched the hose from his grip. The water turned. And this time it was aimed at him. The second the jet hit him, Connolly was airborne. The sheer force lifted him off his feet, sending him crashing backward into the side of his cruiser. He slumped to the ground, gasping, coughing, choking as the water kept coming. His hands flailed uselessly against the pavement, his legs kicking as he tried and failed to get back up. The street was silent, except for the sound of the hydrant roaring its vengeance. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Amara twisted the nozzle shut. The water stopped. Connolly lay sprawled on the ground, drenched, stunned, humiliated beyond repair. Amara stood over him, her breathing heavy, water dripping from her soaked clothes, her expression unreadable. And then she leaned down, just slightly, just enough for him to hear her over his own ragged gasps. Now we're even. Connolly lay on the pavement, drenched, gasping for air, his body heaving with each ragged breath. Water dripped from his uniform, pooling beneath him, soaking into the cracks of the asphalt as his mind reeled from what had just happened. He had lost. Not just physically, not just publicly, but completely. Amara Blackwell had taken his weapon, his control, his dominance, and turned it against him, and now he was lying in a filthy street, humiliated beyond recognition, his authority shattered in front of the very people he was supposed to command. He had always prided himself on control, on ensuring that his presence alone was enough to force compliance, but now that presence was meaningless. He had been bested, overpowered, and made to look like a fool in the middle of a street where people were still watching, some openly, others from the corners of their windows, some suppressing smirks while others merely observed, waiting for what would happen next. His chest burned as he forced himself to move, his limbs sluggish, his muscles trembling from the impact of the water's force. His mind screamed at him to react, to do something, anything, to regain control. But there was nothing left to do. He had escalated the situation past the point of no return, had turned what should have been a routine encounter into a battlefield, and now he was the one lying in the wreckage of his own arrogance. His hand pressed against the wet pavement as he tried to push himself up, but his legs weren't responding the way he wanted them to, his balance still wrecked from the sheer power of the blast that had sent him flying. Amara, still dripping wet, stood above him, her expression unreadable, her stance firm, unwavering. There was no gloating, no smugness in her gaze, only an unwavering steeliness that told him she wasn't afraid of him, had never been afraid of him. He had miscalculated from the start. He had expected her to back down, to comply, to shrink under the weight of his authority like so many before her. He had expected submission, but instead she had given him resistance. And resistance was something he wasn't used to handling. A sharp pain flared in his ribs as he finally forced himself onto his knees, his palms pressing against the pavement as he struggled to steady his breathing. His vision swam for a moment, the world tilting slightly before righting itself, and when he finally managed to look up, he saw Sergeant Fuller standing over him, arms crossed, expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet, simmering anger. What the hell was that? Connolly Fuller's voice was low, dangerous. Connolly didn't answer immediately, his throat too tight, his pride too wounded. He wiped a shaking hand across his face, feeling the sting of his own humiliation settle into his bones. His mind scrambled for an excuse, an explanation, something to justify what had just happened, but there was nothing. He had lost control, plain and simple. He started, but the words felt empty even before they left his mouth. She what? Did her job? Defended herself. Fuller's voice was razor sharp. You escalated this situation past the point of reason, and now you're lying on the damn ground, looking like a drowned rat. You don't think that's a problem? Connolly's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together as the shame boiled under his skin. He could feel it pressing against his ribs, crushing the breath from his lungs, more suffocating than the water that had just blasted him across the pavement. He knew what Fuller was really saying. It wasn't just a problem, it was the problem. Get up, Fuller ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before you embarrass yourself any further. Connolly's fingers curled into fists against the pavement, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to stand, his legs shaky, his uniform clinging uncomfortably to his skin. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, burning into his back, and it took everything in him not to lash out, not to find something, someone, to redirect his humiliation onto. But there was no way out of this. He had done this to himself. Amara didn't move as he rose, didn't shift, didn't flinch. She just watched, waiting. And that made it worse. Fuller exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Get in your car, Connolly. Now. Connolly hesitated for half a second, his pride battling against the command, but in the end he had no choice. Without another word, he turned stiffly, his movements mechanical, and walked toward his cruiser. The inside was damp from his earlier collapse, the seat still wet, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away, to put space between himself and what had just happened. The engine rumbled to life beneath his shaking hands, and as he pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back. He couldn't. But as he drove, his mind raced, the humiliation turning into something darker, something more dangerous. This wasn't over. He would find a way to make sure of that. Amara watched the cruiser disappear around the corner, her breathing finally evening out as the tension slowly drained from her muscles. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to let even a flicker of emotion cross her face. She had expected Connolly to retaliate, had known he wouldn't let something like this go without a fight, but she hadn't expected him to lose control so spectacularly. That moment when the water had turned on him, when he had been thrown across the pavement like a rag doll, had been a shift one that neither of them could undo. Fuller sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before turning to her. "You okay?" Amara nodded once. "I'm fine." Fuller studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "You've made an enemy today." "I didn't make anything," she replied. "He did," Fuller exhaled sharply. "Yeah. And that's what worries me." She didn't argue. She knew Connolly wouldn't let this go. But she also knew she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let some power-hungry cop interfere with that. "Keep your head on a swivel," Fuller said finally. "Guys like him, they don't forget." Amara met his gaze, her voice steady. "Neither do I." She turned away, her hands steady as she picked up her clipboard, her focus shifting back to the hydrant, back to the job she had come here to do. The battle wasn't over, but she wasn't backing down. Connolly sat in his cruiser, gripping the wheels so tightly his fingers ached, his soaked uniform clinging to him like a second skin. The humiliation burned hotter than the afternoon sun, searing into him like a brand that would never fade. Every second of what had just happened played over and over in his mind. Blackwell standing over him, the fire hose wrenched from his grip, the force of the water slamming into his body, knocking him off his feet, sending him sprawling like a rookie in his first street fight. He could still hear the laughter, the gasps, the murmurs of people who had seen him brought low, stripped of the authority he had wielded like a blade for years. He had never been in a position like this before. He had never been the one left on the ground, scrambling to regain his composure. And the worst part wasn't just that he had lost. It was who he had lost to. He clenched his jaw so tightly it sent a sharp pain shooting up to his temples. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. He wouldn't let it be. Blackwell had just written herself into a story that didn't end with her walking away. He wasn't going to be some joke on the streets, some pathetic cop who got bested and backed down. No, this was only the beginning. He had spent too many years making sure people knew their place. He wasn't going to let one firefighter destroy everything he had built. His radio crackled. Fuller's voice came through, sharp and loaded with warning. "Doug, go home. This is done." Connolly didn't respond. He stared ahead, watching as Blackwell continued working, as if she hadn't just dismantled his authority in front of half the damn neighborhood. He should have just walked away, should have let it go, but the rage had already taken root, sinking deep into his bones. It wasn't enough for him to leave. He needed something more. He needed her to understand that this wasn't her victory. This was a temporary setback, and he knew exactly how to make that clear. Without a word, he threw the cruiser into gear, tires screeching against the pavement as he took off down the street. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. He didn't need backup for what he was about to do. He just needed to wait, to be patient. And when the moment was right, he would make sure Blackwell knew exactly who she had messed with. Amara barely flinched as the sound of his cruiser peeled away. She knew better than to think this was over. She had seen the look in his eyes, the barely contained fury that had threatened to consume him even as Fuller forced him to back down. Men like Connolly didn't let things go. They didn't take humiliation lightly. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. But she had work to do, and she wasn't about to let some power-drunk cop stop her from finishing it. She adjusted the final settings on the hydrant, checking the pressure, making sure it was back to full function. The neighborhood needed this hydrant operational. It wasn't just about the technicalities of the job, it was about what it represented. It was about ensuring that when disaster struck, people had the resources they needed to fight back. It was about making sure the city couldn't keep turning a blind eye to the people who lived here, people who had been ignored, dismissed, and neglected for too long. She was just finishing up when she heard the sound of an engine revving behind her. Her muscles tensed before she even turned around. She already knew who it was. Connolly had come back. "Kate," she turned slowly, her expression unreadable, her body language calm, controlled. The cruiser was parked at an angle now, blocking part of the street. Connolly stepped out, his uniform still damp, his face a mask of something unreadable but dangerous. This wasn't a man who had let things go. This was a man who had spent the last few minutes simmering, plotting. And now, he was ready to retaliate. Amara didn't move. She held her ground, her chin lifted slightly as he closed the distance between them. "You think you won something today?" Connolly's voice was low, almost conversational, but she could hear the edge beneath it, the simmering violence barely contained. She didn't respond. But he took another step closer. "You think you're walking away from this?" Her jaw clenched. "I think you should get back in your car and drive away before you make this worse for yourself." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't get to tell me what to do." And then he moved. It happened fast. Dumb. Connolly's hand shot out, grabbing her by the front of her uniform, yanking her forward with enough force to throw her off balance. She felt the sharp pull, the jerk of her body being forced into motion, but before he could fully control the movement, she reacted. Her knee came up, hard, slamming into his stomach. The impact sent him stumbling back a step, but he recovered quickly, his grip tightening. He was stronger than he looked, his hold like a vice. But she wasn't some helpless civilian caught off guard. She had trained for moments like this, had spent years knowing how to fight when she had to. She twisted, using his own grip against him, shifting her weight and wrenching herself free just as his other hand came up, aiming for her shoulder. She ducked under his reach, pivoted, and drove an elbow into his ribs. He let out a sharp grunt, staggering, but he didn't fall. Instead, he came back swinging. His fist cut through the air, aiming for her face. But she moved just in time, feeling the wind of it pass inches from her cheek. She countered, grabbing his wrist mid-motion and twisting it sharply. His balance faltered, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes' surprise. He hadn't expected her to fight back like this. He hadn't expected her to be faster. But before she could press the advantage, he lashed out with his leg, catching her in the side. Pain flared through her ribs as she stumbled back, her breath hitching, but she didn't go down. She braced herself, reset her stance, and then the sound of sirens cut through the air. Both of them froze. The moment stretched, heavy with something unspoken. And then, slowly, Connolly stepped back. His breathing was ragged, his fists still clenched, his eyes burning with something dark and unresolved. "This isn't over," he muttered. Amara straightened, rolling her shoulder slightly, ignoring the ache in her ribs. "It is for now." The sirens grew louder. The patrol cars rounded the corner, and Connolly knew he had lost again. But this time, He didn't wait for someone to tell him to leave. He turned, walked back to his cruiser, and without another word, he was gone. Connolly's cruiser disappeared around the corner, but the tension still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Amara stood in place, her body still pulsing with adrenaline, her ribs aching from where his boot had connected. The fight had been short but vicious, a raw display of power and control, and she knew without a doubt that this wasn't the last time he would come after her. Men like him never let go, never accepted defeat, never allowed the world to see them weak without demanding retribution. And Connolly, despite being soaked, humiliated, and physically outmatched, wasn't finished. If anything, the loss had only fueled his rage, had twisted his pride into something sharper, something uglier. He would find a way to get back at her. She had no doubt about that. The sirens that had driven him away faded, and the street fell into an eerie quiet. The few people who had lingered during the altercation finally exhaled, some shaking their heads, others looking at her with something close to admiration. One older man, his hands calloused from years of work, stepped forward and gave her a nod. "We got your back," he muttered, his voice low but firm. Amara met his gaze and nodded in return. She didn't need thanks. She didn't need recognition. She just needed to finish her damn job. She turned back to the hydrant, her hands steady as she tightened the last bolt, making sure it was fully operational before she packed up her tools. She could still feel the phantom grip of Connolly's hands on her uniform, the impact of his weight against hers, the sheer force of their collision. But she pushed it all down. She had work to do, and she wasn't about to let some angry cop ruin that. As she started back toward her truck, her radio crackled to life. "Blackwell, you clear?" It was her captain, his voice edged with something close to concern. "I'm good," she responded, forcing her tone to stay neutral. "Hydrants fixed." A pause. "Then, come back to the station." She hesitated. She knew what that meant. They'd heard. Someone had called it in. Maybe Fuller. Maybe someone else who had seen the fight go down. Either way, this wasn't over. Not for her. Not for Connolly. Not for the department that would now have to deal with the fallout of a cop getting his ass handed to him by a firefighter in the middle of the street. She sighed, running a hand through her damp hair before tossing her gear into the truck and climbing in. The drive back to the station was silent, save for the steady hum of the engine. She kept expecting Connolly to show up again, to be lurking at some intersection, waiting for her to drop her guard. But he didn't. Not yet. By the time she pulled into the station, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. She barely had time to step out of her truck before the captain was striding toward her, his expression unreadable. "In my office." "Now." She followed without a word, ignoring the glances from the other firefighters in the bay. Some had clearly already heard, their expressions ranging from concern to quiet respect. They knew Connolly. They knew what kind of cop he was. And they knew that whatever had happened out there, Amara hadn't been the one to start it. Inside the office, the door shut behind her with a quiet click. The captain leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his jaw tight. "You want to tell me what the hell happened out there?" She exhaled through her nose. Connolly escalated. "I defended myself. That all." Her silence was answer enough. The captain sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I don't need to tell you what kind of mess this is about to turn into." "No," she said evenly. "You don't." He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Connolly's going to come for you." "I know. And the department's not going to be able to protect you from whatever he tries next." "I know that too." Another silence. Then, finally, the captain pushed away from his desk and walked to the window, staring out at the city beyond. You need to be careful, Blackwell. Men like him, they don't just take a loss and walk away. She swallowed the bitter laugh that threatened to escape. Yeah, I figured that out already. The captain turned back to her, his eyes hard. Then you better be ready. She was. She always had been. When she left the office, the weight of what was coming settled over her shoulders like a lead blanket. Connolly wasn't finished, and she wasn't naive enough to think that this was over. But if he wanted a war, he was going to learn real fast that she wasn't the type to lose. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Amara pulled out of the fire station's lot. The sky above bleeding deep shades of purple and red, the last remnants of daylight clinging to the edges of the city skyline. The tension from earlier still clung to her skin, seeping into her muscles like a toxin she couldn't shake. She knew Connolly wasn't done. Men like him never were. He had been humiliated, stripped of his authority in front of an entire street of people, and the kind of man he was, one who thrived on power, who needed to be feared to feel in control, wouldn't just let that go. He would come back, in one way or another, and when he did, it wouldn't be about making an arrest or enforcing the law. It would be about revenge. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she navigated the streets, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than necessary, scanning for anything out of place. She knew better than to assume he would come at her openly. Not now. Not after everything. He wouldn't risk another public spectacle, not after the way Fuller had already called him out in front of his own. No, whatever he had planned, it would be calculated, quiet, something designed to remind her that, in his world, people like her weren't supposed to win. Her fingers drummed lightly against the dashboard as she turned onto her block, her mind still running through every possibility, every worst-case scenario, when the unmistakable glow of headlights appeared in her mirror. Close. Too close. Her pulse ticked up, a steady drumbeat against her ribs. She kept driving, kept her hands steady, kept her breathing even, but her body had already gone into fight mode. If it was him, if this was how he wanted to play it, she wasn't going to make it easy. She took a right turn, then another, weaving through side streets, testing to see if the headlights would follow. They did. Her jaw clenched as she pulled onto a quieter road, one that ran along the edge of an industrial park, mostly empty at this hour. If Connolly wanted to follow her into the shadows, she would let him. When she finally brought her truck to a slow stop, the car behind her hesitated for a beat before rolling up just a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and there he was. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, she could see the fury radiating off of him in waves. His uniform was gone, replaced by a dark t-shirt and jeans, but there was no mistaking the stiff way he held himself, the anger still seething beneath his skin. This wasn't official business. This wasn't about law and order. This was personal. She didn't move, didn't reach for anything, didn't let an ounce of fear show on her face. She just watched as he took slow, deliberate steps toward her truck, stopping just short of her door. "You've got a lot of nerve," he muttered, his voice low, dangerous. Amara tilted her head slightly. "So do you." He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You think you won something today?" She exhaled through her nose, unamused. "No, I think I did my job. You're the one who turned it into something else." His expression twisted, his fingers twitching at his sides like he was barely restraining himself. "You embarrassed me," he hissed, taking a step closer. "In front of my own. In front of them." "Seems like you did that to yourself," she replied, voice steady. His jaw flexed, and for a moment she could see the war raging in his head, the push and pull between his need to retaliate and the knowledge that any further misstep would be the end of him. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was running on pure emotion now, on the festering need to reclaim his power in the only way he knew how. She met his gaze head-on. "What do you want, Connolly?" The silence between them stretched, taut and unyielding, and then finally his lips curled into something cruel, something hollow. "I want you to remember your place." Amara felt her entire body still, and then she laughed. A short, sharp sound that cut through the thick air like a blade. His face darkened. "You think this is funny?" She leaned back against the headrest, exhaling through her nose as she shook her head. "No," she admitted. "I think it's pathetic." The muscles in his neck tensed, his entire body coiled so tightly it looked like he was seconds away from lunging. But before he could make another move, the sharp chirp of another set of sirens split the air. His head snapped toward the road, just in time to see 2 patrol cars pulling up behind them, their lights flashing but their sirens cutting out as they rolled to a slow stop. Doors opened, and out stepped Fuller. Connolly's entire body went rigid. Amara didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even spare the sergeant a glance as he approached, his expression unreadable. "Doug," Fuller said, voice flat. "You want to explain why you're tailing a city firefighter in the middle of the night." Connolly's mouth opened, then closed, his hands curling into fists before he forced them to relax. She what Fuller cut in. "Fixed a fire hydrant? Embarrassed you? Made you look exactly like the kind of asshole we all already knew you were?" Connolly's entire body vibrated with barely contained rage, but he said nothing. Fuller took another step forward. "Go home, Doug." Connolly's nostrils flared. "You can't." "I can," Fuller interrupted, voice like steel. "And I am. Walk away before you make this worse." For a long moment it seemed like Connolly might refuse, that he might take that final, irreversible step over the edge. But then, slowly he exhaled, shaking his head as he took a single step back, then another. He turned without another word, stalking back toward his car, slamming the door behind him before peeling off down the road. The silence that followed was deafening. Fuller let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face before turning to Amara. "You all right?" She nodded once. "Yeah." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You need anything, you call me." She didn't respond, just watched as he and the other officers got back into their cars, leaving her alone once again. She let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders, feeling the weight of the night settle deep into her bones. This wasn't over. Not really. Men like Connolly didn't just disappear. But tonight, at least, she had won.